Robin, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to get you on, mate.
Yep, thank you for the invitation, Andy. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So obviously we met because whilst you were walking through the crowd at the Sportsmith LA conference, I basically just jumped on you and grabbed you while I could amongst a big audience. Just to begin with, can you just walk us through your background? I know you've worked in a lot of big name organisations, but just kind of bring us through to the current day.
Yeah, so started off as a fitness coach, working in professional football in the Premier League. So lucky enough to work at Manchester United for 10 years in various roles. So going in as a kind of fitness coach, but sports science, strength and conditioning. I then did a PhD into looking how to track and monitor recovery and fatigue, and then also how to then manage that. And that was based from real world key stakeholder head coach questions. So it was a great process to kind of really combine real rigor and science and applied work at the highest level. And then following that, I worked for the Mexican national team for the World Cup in 2018, dipped my toes in golf and boxing. I then went to the US, where I am now, working with Olympic athletes in the lead up to the Tokyo Games and specifically the sprinters. And that was around trying to get a different, broad learning of other athletes and other environments. And my role there was a director of performance and innovation. Also at that point, started to consult in American sport as well. So consulting the NBA in baseball, and then I went to Los Angeles, which is where I am now, to take up a leadership role as director of performance for the Red Bull Group. So developing a facility in Santa Monica, building a staff, building systems, processes, also working across the Red Bull Group's football portfolio. And so that was around 3.5, 4 years, and now I consult both in the US and also Europe with professional teams and organisations, really trying to help them solve performance problems and develop strategic pathways and processes to do so. So yeah, whistle stop tour of my sort of career to date.
Yeah, whistle stop tour of some really good experiences. Obviously, you've touched kind of all aspects of performance in your career. When we met, you were at the Rehab conference, and I'm sure you've been involved in rehab, throughout this kind of career journey you've had so far. Is it just a recency bias, or have I kind of seen you speaking at more rehab events recently? Is rehab like a current or bigger interest of yours within the sort of performance sphere at the moment?
Yeah, I mean it's a good point actually. I think there might be a little bit of recency bias, but I think sort of going through my career, and you generally start in very specific areas, and you kind of work your way up. You develop your skill set, you develop your experiences, and I think the sort of the crux of the presentation and at that Rehab conference was around a lot of my reflections over the last sort of 18 or so years, kind of wearing various hats in that performance and health ecosystem, and also trying to synthesize those reflections and provide a possible option of how to maybe do some of this a little bit better than it's been done in the past, or certainly better than what it was happening 15, 20 years ago, kind of when I first started. So yeah, I think also as I've developed, and we can talk about this a little bit more around the kind of specialist versus generalist profile. I think that I've moved more towards that leadership role, and how to really fully and truly integrate departments and disciplines, which I think is a key area which gets spoken a lot about. But in reality, is there really true integration happening?
Yeah, and in LA, your talk, I'm going to have to read this bit because I will not memorize. I couldn't memorize this, I'm afraid. But
I don't think I could either.
It's called Reformulating Rehab, Harnessing Scientific Approaches and Principles to Measure, Track, and Amplify Return to Play Related Effects and Outcomes. Impossible task for me to memorize that with the size of my brain, but Probably an impossible task for you that I'm going to give you now. Can you give the listeners an overview of why you chose that topic and almost kind of like a Cliff Notes version of kind of what it was about? Obviously, they can't go back and be there now.
Yeah, and it was about 50 minutes, so I'll do my best to try and provide a summary. But I suppose it was kind of split into two sections. The first section was this like reflective process for myself, and the second section was kind of an area where I've specialised and gone into very sort of detail and a lot of depth, and how to maybe bring that to the surface and weave it into a potential process that people can use in their environments when it comes to rehab. I think the key point of the whole topic is that it's not just for rehab. I think that some of the things that I spoke about and then we'll chat about today, I think they can be translated into other various pieces and segments of that kind of performance and health journey within professional sports or other sub-elite populations as well. But I think the first bit was around this kind of reflection, and I actually started with a kind of a series of images of football sort of background, like the team photo at the start of the season, and it was from the 1950s all the way up to today. And so in every picture and image was then a 20-year in the future, and you saw the kind of rise of backroom staff and really the rise of specialists. And it came actually to the latest image, and it was an example from Manchester City, and you'd gone from like tens of backroom staff on this team photo to then the next year it was just the manager, the head coach was Pep. And it wasn't that they had no staff, it was just there's too many staff to fit on the picture. So I think that was a good illustration of kind of what are our challenges nowadays with this kind of rise of the specialists, because it's not only just the number of staff, it's very much the specialisation of those profiles. And that's kind of the starting point of maybe why we have a struggle to integrate various disciplines. And the other kind of piece to this would be around how we also structure our health and performance departments around athletes and teams. And we always like to use this almost wheel visual of where the athlete's in the middle and you have all these disciplines around it. And I think the first bit I of course agree with. I think everything has to be athlete centred, but how these disciplines then work from the outside in, I think we probably need to rethink it a little bit, because I think what it does is it shows that there's all these disciplines around an athlete, all with different backgrounds, different education, different belief systems, different biases. And so what I've seen in various roles I've held is that a lot of these disciplines and specialists approach the athlete and maybe the performance and health problem with a very singular and siloed lens. So I think that kind of gives us a bit of a problem to begin with, and I think that's also one of the main reasons why we lack integration sometimes in different ecosystems. And there's a great, I use it's a really good study from this year actually, and it kind of goes back into kind of where I've specialised to an extent from my research and PhD work in this sort of topic of performance recovery and recovery in general, really, whether it's in rehab or from a performance perspective. But that study looked at it was a study on cold water immersion, and they submerged one limb of a healthy male in cold water immersion, the other limb in thermoneutral water. And they showed that, well, the cold limb reduced blood flow, tick, that's the whole purpose of using cold water immersion. But there was also a reduction in amino acid incorporation into the muscle cell. So the reason why I think that's a great study to show whether or not you have integration between disciplines in a department is, well, if a nutritionist or a dietitian looks at that, they think, well, of course we're not going to use cold water immersion, because my role as a dietitian and nutritionist is to make sure we increase protein synthesis with this amino acid incorporation. But if you're a physio or a physiologist and you want to reduce inflammation, well, reducing blood flow is a kind of precursor to doing so. So that just gives an example of whatever lens you look at the athlete or the outcome is going to be really crucial to the next phase. And so from my perspective, how can we agree on the outcome that's needed, and then all these disciplines around the athlete can work together harmoniously, hopefully, to achieve those outcomes. I think we definitely start on the wrong foot if we look at these problems and outcomes as separate disciplines. So that was kind of the first topic of reflection, and kind of course there is going to be structural organisational aspects that's going to dictate some of those factors. But then is it how do we then get different staff from different backgrounds, belief systems and education biases to maybe look at an outcome as a team approach rather than from a kind of siloed perspective. So that was kind of the first piece, and then there was then a little bit around what are the kind of the red flags, so to speak, when it comes to rehab specifically. And these were like real world examples from, again, across the last sort of 17 years of only certain disciplines or backgrounds working with athletes at certain stages, not using objectivity or monitoring when it's a rehab situation, but doing so when it's a kind of healthy performance scenario. So there was kind of a few of those which I think were a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but they were real-world examples of kind of maybe the outcome of some of these issues of a siloed sort of process within a department. So the key piece, I think, is how we tend to dichotomize some of the terminology and some of our functions in a department when we work with athletes. And normally it's sort of injured, non-injured, performance, medical, and then rehab performance. And it seems to be there's been like almost like a waterfall effect of these aspects. I think that's also an area we have to try and overcome. And I think that a key way of doing that, not only from a kind of human and perspective and a leadership perspective, is to really be clear on the decision-making processes and how we integrate objectivity as a kind of common language for all staff members.
Cool. I think you've done an amazing job setting the scene for the rest of this conversation, and also getting 50 minutes rattled down to a few minutes there is quite impressive. And I've got this novel idea in my head that you walked through a football clubhouse, saw the staff numbers increase on the photos, but probably saw the number of mullets decrease as the years went on at the same time. I think that with kind of regards to rehab, and I've experienced this with the podcast, kind of interviewing lots of people, there's this kind of universal agreement that rehab is a multidisciplinary process. There's lots of stakeholders involved. And I think it doesn't really matter which teams you visit or who you speak to. Communication, collaboration, integration, whatever kind of buzzwords we want to use, they're either problems at teams or they're something that teams are handling, but it's always something they have to be really aware of to make sure their processes are working out effectively. I think a lot of we all want to claim and think that our communication and our kind of integration in rehab is going well, but I kind of also think there's this sort of notion that 80% of people think they're an above average driver. So there is a disconnect, and I don't want to be sitting on an ivory tower recording a podcast in terms of how I'm viewing this, but hopefully you kind of get what I mean there. What I'd love to kind of kick off with, and this might ruffle some feathers, me saying all this anyway, but what's the difference between true integration in rehab and bringing all these different specialists together versus just sort of talking about collaboration and communication like we do?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to talk about as well is you mentioned that kind of driver analogy, and I think often when maybe departments either don't communicate, that it can be also associated with, oh well, it's a real harmonious and functional process because maybe there's just no communication at all. So that's, I think, a key piece to this. And I mean, from my experience, I think it's largely around how can you construct a environment and a team and also methods to communicate, and also sometimes it might be often very frequent reminders of what the key principles may be of how we're approaching rehab and other areas of this kind of performance and health ecosystem. So something that I've done in the past that I think has been quite effective is structuring team meetings and then sub-department meetings, and making sure that the outcome that we're looking to achieve with a certain athlete or group at a certain time is frequently discussed. But yeah, I think sometimes in the event of potentially disciplines and humans not interacting, or sometimes not being able to, due to whether it's a infrastructure issue or whether it's a location issue, like ensuring our meeting structure is set up so we are talking about the outcome, we are reminding each other about what is the outcome that we're looking to achieve. And also I think the next piece is not always every member of staff has a key sort of role in that outcome. And so I think the next big thing is around humility. And I think there's certain processes during rehab where the physiotherapist and the dietitian and nutritionist are probably the most important members of staff, because the outcome at the time is certainly prioritised to their skill set. So it's also when we talk about skill set and competency, I think from a more leadership perspective is how you getting the right people in the right seats at the right time, and ensuring that the skill set that a certain member of staff has is utilised most effectively and not discipline driven. And an example of this often is sometimes the acute management of injuries or the acute management of flare-ups during a rehab process, because there's going to be times where we're going to want to try and accelerate some stimulus and some load, and there might be an adverse reaction, or equally there might be very positive reactions during that process. And so in that scenario, is there a physiologist on or in the multidisciplinary team who has real specialist knowledge of how to potentially dampen down some inflammatory cascade and processes, or can we amplify some of the adaptation we're looking for during that rehab phase? And so I think historically it's always been down to, well, if there's pain or there's inflammation, this discipline is the one who is in control of that process. But I think that's also a great example of where bringing in that background and expertise from other areas, I think, only adds to the positive outcome that we're looking to achieve. But I think that's where some of the communication, some of the meeting structures that you can put in place around, well, if the outcome is around reducing a secondary damage phase inflammatory process because we've accelerated a period of rehab, well, maybe there's a great collaboration opportunity for a clinical member of staff who has a very detailed knowledge around that process, but also maybe a physiologist who knows maybe some of the timing and protocols, and maybe what are the contraindicating effects of some of the other things that we're putting the athlete under. So I think yeah, communication, like talk is cheap, pardon the pun, like it's, yeah, we can say like communicate more, but I've been in certainly environments where if certain practitioners or departments can't communicate through whatever means or just won't, I think you then have to really try and manipulate some of those communication pathways to then try and guide them to do so. And I think daily frequent reminders of what those outcomes that we're looking to achieve as a team, not in silos. We're not talking about what the dietitian's outcome is all the time. It's like, what's the outcome for the athlete? Because then I think effectively dietitians, whether it's mental performance practitioners, physiologists, physiotherapists, they can all come in and add their contribution from their skill set and competence. And again, sometimes there might be a humility moment where actually my role as a physiologist is probably not the most important and effective right now, and then at least that saves up time for that practitioner to go somewhere else and focus their time where there might be another athlete in the team who really needs that focus. So I think it's always a constant evolving system where we're trying to pull experts in and out to really achieve those outcomes.
I love that example. I think it really well circles back to you saying kind of specialist generalist as well, in the sense that I think what you want to do is bring the best people in at the right moment, and collaborate. I'm using the buzzwords again,
Yeah.
but from an education perspective, because then if you're, whether you're the physio, the S&C, whoever you are, you're then getting specialist education that upskills you as a generalist by working with that person. So I think it's a really nice kind of department-wide development opportunity when you get that right.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you kind of keep to that traditional model, or some of those examples at the start that we talked about around discipline driven, then you might be missing out on some absolute world-class expertise from, it could be an S&C coach who has a real biomechanical mind mapping model, who can really contribute to a rehab or an athlete who is in a situation scenario who is injured, just because of what our job titles or disciplines may be. So I think that's a key thing, that I think having this more outcome sort of minded approach and keeping to some key principles, I think is one of the most important things for true integration within this kind of rehab phase.
As someone that's worked in lots of departments, consulted to lots of teams and organisations as well, I respect that each environment's different and has its own sort of challenges and makeup. When you go into a team or you're at a team, and we're talking about rehab, what are the kind of actual behaviours, habits, maybe systems that you found really help achieve integration? We're agreeing that we need to get people to integrate and communicate and collaborate, etc. But what are the sort of like actual tangible things that on a granular level have helped you, or you've seen work well at achieving it?
Yeah, well, I think we're in the kind of decision making game, and I think it's one of the fundamental outcomes from a practitioner's point of view is around how do we make less bad decisions across the journey, and how can we minimize uncertainty, knowing that we're never going to be certain in how we kind of move through different rehabs. And I think that's also, it kind of reminds me around this other topic, like we've spoken about, like the specialist and the generalist, and then you also have like the complexity and then the simplicity of a process. And we've often, it's always versus, so it's like, are you a specialist or a generalist, or it's complexity versus simplicity. And I think that's probably something we have to maybe rethink, and it's how you balance the two, because, not to go off on a bit of a tangent, but like I would consider that there's a specialist area that I've gone into very detailed around PhD research and beyond, but that really helps me be a better generalist, because it means I can go into detail about a topic and really understand maybe mechanistic cellular aspects to science. But then that reminds me that if I'm dealing with another practitioner, that they're also doing that, and so you have to sort of hone in to kind of zoom out. So I think it's the same with complexity and simplicity. I think we have to be very simple in terms of certain parts of this process, and I think the simplicity for me is, now when I either go into teams or when I've led teams myself, how do you provide a very simple decision-making framework which is inherently complex? And I think that we don't need to, there's a lot of, I think, discussion around sort of systems theory and complexity at the moment in our field, and I think it's, for me, that's really a given. I think that's something that we should all sort of understand and respect from kind of day one when we start studying, whether it's sport and exercise science or physiotherapy or medicine, etc. But I think now, going back to your question, it's around how can I help a system make less bad decisions. And I think the starting piece, or the starting outer layer, is around what are the relevant factors that we're trying to change and influence. And that could be something local, or it could be something systemic when we work with athletes. And again, as a reminder, this isn't just inclusive to rehab scenarios. This is inclusive, I think, to any type of performance problem working with athletes. I think that the next piece, and so when we understand what those relevant factors we're trying to change are, and that might be like improving hypertrophy, for example. We then need to understand, well, in this ecosystem, who are those individuals and teams who are best suited to tackle this outcome if it's hypertrophy. And so that starts to see, well, what are our competencies for our team, what are our backgrounds, and staying away from this kind of discipline driven approach where, well, if it's hypertrophy, well, it has to be just an S&C involved. Well, what about the dietitian, what about the nutritionist? That they're equally important in that kind of that process. We've just talked a little bit about that, but I think the next bit is like, how do you then match? So a key principle that I would often use is, how are you matching your measurables? So what can you measure? What are your metrics? How can you appropriately match them to that outcome? So if we're looking at hypertrophy, what are those measures that we think are appropriate to measure? And so once you have those kind of outer layers in place, the next phase is around, well, we're looking to change something, we're looking to influence something. So how do we know when something has changed? And so one thing that I've seen done very rarely in our industry is environments or groups of practitioners really understanding what a target change is in a particular metric, tool or measure. And so that involves a whole different process around data integration. But I think we've unfortunately it seems like the bar in our industry around objectivity is just collecting data, and that's fine. So if I'm an S&C coach or a physiotherapist or even a sports scientist, whatever that is, it's, well, if I'm collecting data using whether it's a force platform or whether it's a load cell or a transducer, then that's kind of good enough. I'm kind of doing what I need to do, and then we move on to the next phase. And I think that's an area where we probably all need to improve. And in past environments that I've been involved in, we've worked very hard to understand those target changes. So if we need to know if we have actually made an improvement or a change in hypertrophy, for example, we know, and then we can then move on to the next, right, what is our next challenge? What's our next objective in this process? And I suppose the real middle centre part of this decision-making process is around being very clear and also consistent of the interventions that we're going to use to execute some of the work that we're doing. So that's kind of like a sort of a layered approach where I think it can be quite simple in terms of understanding relevant factors. How are we going to assess change? What is that change and that sort of numeric target that we're looking for? And also, let's be very consistent and clear in our execution of interventions that we're matching these things together. So that's been a way which I think has worked quite effectively. And we spoke at the start around like the communication piece, and I think having that decision-making process at the centre and establishing those communication structures around it, whether it be how we do meetings, how often we do meetings, who's going to be speaking at those meetings, how many people are going to be there, use of time. I think they're things that can complement that kind of straightforward process as it would be.
Yeah, I think we get in this kind of the cart pulls the horse situation quite easily in sport, where we don't have that communication piece at the front where we ask the question of like, what is the adaptation or what's the target we're going for? And I think we quite often skip a step and we look at, well, what does rehab commonly look like for this injury? And we sort of just pick the objective tests before the question, because almost by association we go, okay, it's an Achilles injury, therefore I've got to have this test. And it might be the right test, but we're getting there in the wrong order, I think, quite classically. And I'm guilty of it. I think, we've probably all done it. But it sounds like quite simple. A simple shuffle of how you approach the process changes how you get there in a more meaningful and strategic way.
Yeah, absolutely, Andy. And I think one of the key areas that made me kind of like focus on this and maybe like understand it a little bit more was like from a research perspective, we kind of have on one side like very isolated methodological studies that might say, well, doing this exercise at this dose is this outcome. And it might be in relation to an injury, for example, Nordics or Copenhagen's, for example. Very, very simple, but kind of lacks that ecological validity. But then on the other side, we've then we then start to develop frameworks and also like milestone criteria based sort of rehab plans, which I think that criteria approach is certainly a advancement on just using basic healing times or times that maybe we used to 20 years ago. But I still think there's a next level, because I still think there's some drawbacks to just using these kind of criteria based sort of longer milestones. So we're going to test or we're going to assess the capacity of an athlete or a quality of the rehab or the injured area at 6 weeks, at 12 weeks, at 18 weeks, etc. But how you kind of lead up, what's that runway to getting up to those milestones? That's something I think is really key now, and this is probably the crux of reformulating rehab. How do we develop those kind of objective measurement systems to making sure once we are on our runway up to 12 weeks, we're not getting there and we're like, well, we're miles off, or we've actually gone in the wrong trajectory. So I think we all know that when we work with athletes in rehab, you're making daily decisions. And so whatever our objective is, we have to really start to match, again, it's the key word here, we have to match the appropriate monitoring tools with where we're trying to go. And then there's no reason why, if you're an athlete in a rehab scenario, like why you can't keep being stimulated and stressed if you're responding well. And I think that's also where I think even in, whether we term it like in healthy athletes, we've kind of lost sight of the response to stress when it comes to monitoring. And I think this is something we need to really grab hold of in rehab. Like and again, this was back to the reflections piece. I remember at Man United, it would be sort of rehab sequences of 2 days on, 1 day off, or different things like that, which when you think about it, like why would it be 2 days on, one day off? If you can stress and stimulate an adaptation effectively, the only reason you would maybe sort of like pull on the brakes is if they were responding negatively or there was a temporary reduction in function. But if they're responding really well and you can keep pushing, then I think the monitoring tools that we have can optimize some of these rehab scenarios, and it can allow practitioners, whether it's the specialists or whether it's the skill sets in physiotherapy, S&C, sports science, physiology, to really continue to accelerate some of the outcomes. So I think that I would love to see in the future that we start to develop these kind of micro monitoring systems in between these kind of criteria milestone time points. And I think we'll see, again, done in the right way, I think we'll see some positive outcomes to that.
It's, talking to you now and also listening to your talk in LA, it's really clear that you've been able to kind of marry really effectively kind of academic terminology and sort of scientific rigor to real life practical scenarios, and in the context of today's conversation, rehab. I want to give you an observation or reflection of mine, and I just want to hear your take on it. I've studied and practiced as a physio in the UK and in America, and gone through the sort of educational process twice uniquely. I won't go into that. Along that journey, what's been really clear as a theme for how you become a physio, and I think it reflects practice, at least in those two continents. There's a lot of emphasis in your training on diagnostic and clinical reasoning for forming a good hypothesis and diagnostics at the beginning of an injury, but we don't necessarily habitually apply or learn to apply that same thought process during the rehab. So we think all about how, is it this injury or this? What's the differential? But then we kind of lose that process during our methods for actually going through the rehab process afterwards. Is that, I'd just love to know if you agree, disagree, or what your experience has been on at least my experience that I'm sort of sharing.
Yeah, no, I think I've also worked with and led and seen some of those observations firsthand as well. And I think, the first thing, it's similar to what we discussed at the start around what is the education system, how is it gearing up practitioners to deal with some of these processes. And I think that once upon a time, there was, again, going back to one of the reasons why I had the team photo every 20 years was that, at one point in time, if we take English football, there might have been a manager and that was it. And then it was a manager and maybe first team coach, and then manager, first team coach, and then maybe a kit man, and then it might have been a physio. And I think that the physio role was one of the first roles that kind of existed in that kind of high performance environment. And at that time, the physio needed to wear every hat. And a good example of this would be when I first started at Manchester United, and again, they'd had fitness coaches and physios, but the physios at the time, they used to run the bleep test. And so the kind of traditional sort of assessment of fitness back then, and still maybe now, but there was a time point where now we've got these specialists that have come in with a different education background who are specialised in certain areas. So it was almost like there's this process now of a very broad discipline and education, and now we've had this rise of specialists who have then come in to take over, not in a negative way, just again it's matching skill set with objective and with outcome. And so now we see that we do have just a large amount of specialists coming in. It could be the same for acute management of injury as well. Like there's physiologists who understand that inflammatory process and whether or not we can upregulate gene expression or cellular signaling. And so I think some of the roles that were once done and maybe what our education is becoming a little bit now diluted by other specialists. So I think this is where in rehab scenarios there has to be that real like team effort of, well, from a data perspective, from objectivity perspective, like that is a very specialist area that maybe only a certain background is exposed to or learns about. So it's now unrealistic to expect a physio, S&C coach, nutritionist or dietitian to understand some of those like key principles around how to use objectivity and data to make decisions. So yeah, absolutely, I see that, and I think it maybe goes back to one of those key principles of humility. And in that team, can you put your hand up and say, well, actually, I don't know the most about this area, but we have this person on our team who specialises in this, and so how do we then integrate that person into the process? And that's where I think we're also struggling a little bit, and I see it time and time again when it comes to the topic of data or assessing athletes or monitoring athletes, and it's almost like, well, the sports scientist does that, you do that, tell me the outcome, tell me the result. And you have to be involved in it, you've got to want to do it. And I think that maybe this kind of bar that's really low nowadays when it comes to sports science or the use of data isn't really helping us, because again, I think that practitioners are going to make a decision whether or not the data says one thing or another, because I think people have made their mind up. They're happy with just having that data to their disposal or expecting someone else to do the test. And an example I would have is that in a rehab scenario, there'd be a certain injury. It could be an injury to like the shoulder region, and there could be a very specific movement that could be turned then into a test, because we can measure maybe force on a load cell or a transducer. But that's just kind of a made up test. It's very specific to maybe the mechanism, but we don't know anything about that test. We also may know that it's actually highly unreliable and it's very difficult to reproduce the same results in absence of injury. But I think that the mindset is still to go to very much specificity, and so that's where I think, from a clinical perspective and also from a perspective that is people who are savvy with understanding what a meaningful change may be in a metric or how to even choose a metric in the first place, there's got to be a lot more work done on both sides. So not only from people wanting to know more about the detail and the depth, but also the individuals or groups who are trying to educate other disciplines. There's probably got to be a coming together in that part.
Not profession specific, but just across rehab as a whole, from what you see at teams and common practice, where do you think we've got good clarity in our processes and what we're going after, and where do you think we're really going after bigger bets and guesswork?
Oof, that's a good question. Well, I've sort of talked about the kind of objectivity side. I don't think we have very good clarity in that side. I think timing of potentially monitoring assessment, the difference between milestone assessment and monitoring, I think there's definitely not clarity there. There's definitely more work to be done. I think there's elements of where it's done really well, and I think we've discussed a small kind of decision making process and framework which can help people get there. But yeah, it is a really interesting question, because there's certainly environments where it's completely polar opposite, and there might be a rehab scenario and we have this issue of load upon load because maybe one member of the multidisciplinary team is working on certain exercises for the outcome they believe is really important, which might be, for example, just like reducing pain sensation. But then you might have another person in that team who's trying to actually improve force output. But what happens throughout the course of a day, that athlete is exposed to two different stimuli, which actually might be too much that they can handle. And so there's a real breakdown. And again, it goes back to being clear on what the outcome is. Is the outcome here around reducing pain from this practitioner's perspective, or is it about how can we improve force production and output over a period of time? So I think that's something that I often see as a real pitfall, and it goes back to, like, there is no integration there, but they may think there's integration because they don't really communicate with one another. So how do you then effectively create that communication link? And I think it involves a lot of the things we've talked about around trying these frequent reminders and trying to blend people, staff, departments together. And I think objectivity, which is linked to a kind of unified outcome, is certainly a way to do that.
How do you sort of approach the runway of, like, whether someone has the right to test? And what I mean by that is, it's really easy to say, okay, you look at the physical demands and put it in sequential order, but there's this notion where you kind of can find yourself in a situation where you say, yeah, it should be right, let's try that, and that's probably not the right moment. How do you sort of approach, like, objectively speaking or scientifically, building the right runway to be safe and effective at what you're going to test or when you're going to test it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it starts off with terminology, and so in a previous role of mine where I was in a leadership role and I had kind of responsibility of trying to drive things forward, I actually wanted to try and kind of remove the use of the word test, because testing to me may be a difference in what testing to a S&C coach may be, or a dietitian or a physiotherapist. So I think we kind of like we saw that was a little bit of a roadblock. So terminology is massive. I think that, again, I'm going to get to that question in a second, but as a tangent, like, having agreed, like, definitions of things within multidisciplinary teams to create interdisciplinary work, I think is really important. So a real world example is, again, in my recent leadership role as a interdisciplinary team, we worked on, and I asked every member of staff, like, write down your definition of what interdisciplinary work is and what trust is, and then tell me how you want to communicate within that team. And so every member of staff did this, and then at the end of the day we all kind of presented what it all meant to us, and of course there was similarities and there was clear kind of consensus in certain things. So we came up with agreed, shared definitions for what interdisciplinary working meant. So how would we go about our work day to day? How would we kind of treat each other? Also, what did trust mean? How do we want to live this work? How do we want to kind of mean what we say what we mean? Integrity. And then we had we did a great workshop around examples of basically really good communication and really bad communication. And it's quite, I'm laughing a little bit now because I remember I pulled up the people in America may not know what I'm talking about now, but the Neil Warnock footage. So old school football manager, and he would just like absolutely hammer and rollick players at half time, and that was kind of his communication style. But it was used as a indication, an example of like for us, is that how we think effective communication is, or is that something that is completely ineffective? So I think doing those things as a group, I think it can be really effective. So yeah, I've actually forgot what was the original question, Andy. I've actually forgot. I've gone off on a tangent around.
How do you sort of create the right runway or right to assess, test, look at a milestone in rehab?
So I started off with the terminology and then went on a tangent around sort of defining different things. But I think,
just to interrupt, I just covered my bases by completely rewording the question to not use the word test in isolation.
I just reminded
you gave me the opportunity to defend myself ahead of time.
That was the plan of forgetting the question. So I think it's kind of illogical to me to almost have a subjective kind of decision to make an objective assessment of a quality. So I think it's about how can you reverse engineer and regress maybe the quality that you're looking to quantify, and whether that is going from using an IKD, eccentric, isometric, and then also manipulating different angles around a joint. Maybe that's a way of doing it. But I think there's certainly an issue where you have an athlete who goes through a period of time, and then it's almost there's a clearance time point. I think that's a little bit illogical to me, unless there's like a real clear medical or clinical contraindication that's set by whether it's a surgeon, etc. But there's often there's going to be ways in which we can regress and then progress that athlete into the desired assessment that it may be. And I think that's something that I think is really big, and we need to really, I think, work a little bit more diligently to understand what those may be. We would call them like waterfall processes around monitoring during rehab. So you may be starting off within safe ranges, it may be isometric contractions, but we're understanding and we're quantifying the output. We're also assessing pain as well, and so understanding and objectifying how pain changes, and not sort of just using from a 0 to 10 pain scale. If it's anything less than a 3 or a 2 or a 4, then it's fine. No, it's individual fluctuation. And so we've done some really good work where we've looked at increases or reduction in force alongside changes in pain sensation, and that can also give us an indication of whether it's a positive adaptation to the load or whether it's maybe a negative adaptation and we may be maladapting over time. So I think they're those processes which, between these milestones, I think are really imperative and important for us to try and kind of work and develop dependent on the particular rehab scenario as well.
I think the pain one's fascinating as well, because we'll use it early on in rehab as something that we anchor how a certain thing is feeling, maybe a certain tissue, whatever the situation is, and we'll say, okay, out of 10, how bad's that pain? And the rehab looks like a certain way at that point in time and has a certain sort of set of demands on it. And then a month later, we'll ask the same question and we'll compare pain 4 weeks later to pain 4 weeks prior. But the demands of the rehab will be completely different. Be completely different movement patterns, different loads, different angles, different positions. And we'll sort of compare the two pain scores, but almost forget that the physical demands are completely different.
Absolutely. And
it's completely separate, but we kind of still look at pain as like this consistent metric that can be relied upon under the same conditions, even though the conditions completely changed.
Yeah. And again, and there's so many things to unpack in that as well, around like asking subjective questions of athletes or patients, that is around like pain, and just saying how you pose the question around pain can also influence the response. And a lot of my PhD work was around subjective markers of fatigue, soreness, and sleep quality. And if you or different staff asked and posed questions in certain ways and manners, there would be different responses. So we made sure that if we're doing a test during rehab, I've just used the word test, so I need to take that one back. So if we're monitoring the response of a short rehab phase, for example, like we need to make sure we're showing the athlete that scale, and then they can then reliably point to or articulate where their pain level is at on that particular situation under those standardized conditions. So I think that a lot of the time when we use subjective markers, they can be a little bit dummy down and they probably don't get the respect they deserve. And so I think you can also get to the point where you're asking players and athletes how painful this is or what's the pain level too many times during a day, and then that gets into a whole host of other issues. So yeah, I think that the standardization of these things is really important, and I think that it's disappointing that we're still trying to improve that in sort of 2025 around like making sure we are standardizing the time where we are assessing or monitoring athletes in rehab, and also asking specific questions around self-reports.
I've got one more kind of big question for you, which is, I made a note when I was listening to you in LA, and you said something that echoed something similar that Alex Wolff said when I spoke to him on the pod a long time ago, around being outcome-based, process-guided, and adaptation-focused, was something that I kind of wrote down as a little sort of summary sentence from your talk, and I think you might have said those words or similar words in the talk itself. To sort of bring this to life and make it more tangible, how can people sort of apply that in terms of actions? If that's kind of like a philosophy, if we like, or a principle that we apply to rehab, is there things that people can strategically do, maybe in meetings or the way that they conduct their processes between within their sort of interdisciplinary department? Is there things they can do that are tangible that bring that to life, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing is having an outcome. Like you'd be surprised that in some instances maybe there isn't an outcome. Like, as in, people haven't even thought about that first aspect. Or, I mean, if you're working with a Premier League team, there's always an outcome. Like, you're all working towards winning a game every 3 days or every week, and that is your North Star, everything you do. And that might involve then, well, how do we get a player back quicker in a rehab process, because our outcome is to win more games. So I think I've worked in other environments where that outcome was a little bit more cloudy, and there wasn't that kind of continued almost striving for excellence as well. And you can have a complacency can set in, and outcomes can then become a bit wishy-washy. So I think that first topic of being clear on the outcome is really important, and if the environment doesn't push you towards that, then you've got to work really well as a team to understand that, but also agree on that. And I think we've talked about whether it's a decision-making process or framework, or whether it's key principles of communication. And again, in a meeting, like if we're talking about athletes, well, this athlete's with us for today or for a week or for a year, or he's a striker in our team. Well, what's the outcome we're looking to achieve? And those like frequent daily reminders, sometimes it can be tedious for people to hear, but I think they're the things that once you hear that all the time, several times a week, then I think staff then can almost be honed to understanding that that's really important. And I think the next piece around the process, and again, sometimes outcome is you might not get there because of various factors that are out of your control. What you can control is the process, and I've spoke to Duncan French about this quite a bit around like increasing the probability of success. And for me, that lies in how well you can execute your processes and systems, and understanding that those processes and systems are, whether they're evidence informed or you've got the right people in the right seats doing the right things, so you know that part of the process is a big tick. So I think that's once that execution is successful, I think that gives you every probability to reach those outcomes that you talk about. And I think the last part of that kind of triangulation model is around adaptation. And I think everything we do is really around like what is the change we're trying to influence and trying to make. We know that there's going to be various factors that we have to consider which might influence that adaptation. And that's a great point of how you start to like also introduce new members of staff to an ecosystem, and some really impactful examples that I can call upon around, well, you might be a dietitian or a mental performance practitioner, and the S&T team might be having a departmental meeting around how we aligned on our methodology to improve hypertrophy outcomes. And the dietitian and mental performance practitioner might be, well, that's nothing to do with me, that's an S&C thing, which is the big, that's right, you've just broken rule number one. And a lot of the time I would kind of encourage and also sometimes mandate that some of those staff, whether you're a dietitian or a sports site, go into those meetings and also learn, but also test them, ask them basic questions, like ask them, well, what are you talking about? And that also gave an element of respect for the different practitioners in the room. But of course, a dietitian or a nutritionist role in hypertrophy is crucial. There might also be, from a mental performance perspective, it's like some of the profiling that we may do, there might be also a behaviour change that we may have to understand, or a relationship with food which might have to be understood, or what are their training habits. And so all of a sudden, what turned into, or what was supposed to be an S&C meeting around hypertrophy training methods, very, very cut and dry, is now a completely sort of evolved performance integration meeting involving different disciplines. And I think once that process sort of continues and evolves, and I think that's really good integration from my perspective. So yeah, I think I think those kind of, that triangulation around outcome process adaptation, I think is really, really important, and a key principle to move forward and improve rehab outcomes, integration in high performance.
Cool. Beautiful summary statement, and way to bring that full circle.
Yeah.
Then, by the way, that was very slick.
Yeah.
But mate, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute privilege to hear you speak about rehab and just performance in general. You know, I know this doesn't just apply to rehab, the stuff we've said today or you've said today. Where can people follow you and find you online if they want to see what you're up to?
Yeah, there's one thing that, because we talked about the sort of specialist versus generalist, and kind of my thoughts around, well, they shouldn't be kind of opposing constructs, they're things that should be balanced. And I think that it's certainly helped me diving into a specialist area then to be a better generalist. But I think also in our industry, you've got this rise of specialists in the departments around, like the traditional physiotherapist, nutritionist, sports science. We're getting biomechanists as well. So there's also like the sub topics, and like speed has become highly specialised, and developing speed qualities and sprinting. And so you've also got this now coming into the fore around, well, you might have an external speed coach who is working with one of the athletes in a rehab scenario outside and external to potentially a team environment. And so that also brings up other sort of challenges to truly integrating a team, and also different philosophies, methodologies, and becoming hyper kind of focused on one area of this kind of, I always kind of, an example I had with two sports scientists who I work with and were in my team, and I drew a big circle and like just put a little dot to one side and say, out of the whole all-encompassing process that we are with this athlete at this time, we're this little speck. It's kind of sports science, biomechanics, whatever it may be, this little speck. So to have then externals coming in, and there's these super focused specialists and specialism around, say, a certain area, that can create a little bit of noise into the whole integration process. So that's also a thing we probably should be wary about in the future. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, as it was something that I think might be the next challenge that we face when trying to integrate in not just a internal team, but now we need to bring in some of the externals as well.
No, I've been there myself. I used to work for Total Performance, and I would go in as the tendon guy or as a tendon person, just for Achilles and patella. And I think physio is the most extreme example of that, where you can have a specialist per injury per body part. Yeah. And depending on the sport, then depends on what injury expert you bring in for that. And it's not that doesn't bring value, of course it does, but yeah, it's a whole nother sort of like layer of expertise that's kind of coming into teams' infrastructures. So
yeah, interesting times.
Yeah, where can people follow you, find you? What's the sort of channels that you exist on?
Yeah, I mean, I need to improve on my social media presence, but I'm doing a bit more LinkedIn now and sharing some of the work that I've done over the years, and there's a lot of work to come, a lot of research and applied work coming out in the next sort of months around that time from Manchester United, and also looking at how some of the training and response monitoring can be linked to injury risk. So some exciting aspects there, and also some cool stuff around getting perspectives from some of the world's experts around some of the things we've talked about, around how do we monitor training effects in these sort of performance and rehab scenarios. So yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best place, but also Instagram and also X as well. I'll occasionally post some good work when I see it. So yeah, but always interested to speak to like-minded people, and yeah, I'm across the US, Europe, and the UK at the moment, so a lot of travelling. So if I'm in the area, it's always good to connect and grab a coffee or a beer at some point with people. So yeah.
Cool. Well, mate, thank you for today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Cheers, Andy.